Module 17, Weight Loss and Making Weight. Do athletes have an easier time at maintaining their body mass? Well, the stereotype is that we see athletes as these lean, toned, and strong individuals where body composition and maintaining body mass are tightly controlled with all the ease in the world. And this isn't necessarily the case. There are a lot of athletes who do struggle with maintaining their body mass as well as their body composition. In fact, one of the most important issues really to look at in these struggles is whether the athlete's desired body fatness is actually less than what is considered healthy or normal. And that's a big concern for us as sports nutritionists. We don't want to have the person have a low amount of body composition just because, well, they feel like they need to be at that particular body composition level, because it's often unnecessary for sport and for competing, and in some cases can actually hurt the athlete. So we want to be very, very careful of this. So this subsequently has led to a lot of dangerous practices in sport in trying to achieve what the athlete considers to be their ideal body composition or ideal body mass. So this can harm them physiologically as well as psychologically. Why do athletes fixate on body mass and composition? Well, some of them are trying to achieve a pre-designated competitive weight. At the top of the list here, wrestlers. They are notorious for trying to make a lower weight class by dehydrating themselves. They'll lose about 5% of their body mass each week to attain a lower weight so that they can enter a lower weight class and then compete at that particular weight class to have some sort of biomechanical advantage. There are several weight classes. The NCAA actually has 10, so this is something that if you're dealing with wrestlers, you do want to consider and take a look at very, very closely so you can help these athletes better understand the effects of weight loss on their performance. Rowers tend to be of lightweight. They have similar losses of body mass to wrestlers. You'll find males that generally are not over 72.5 kilograms, and they lose about 7.8% of their body mass for the competitive race. The crew average is not usually greater than 70 kilograms, so they're fairly light individuals. For females, they typically don't weigh over 59 kilograms, and they lose about 5.9% of their body mass. The crew average is usually not greater than 56.7 kilograms. As far as a lightweight football player, a couple days prior to the game, about 71.8 kilograms. So there are some football players who feel that the speed can be hindered if they're carrying around a couple extra kilograms of weight, so they'll try to lose that body mass to pick up some speed. Horse racing. Surprisingly, this is one area that doesn't get a lot of attention. However, it's very, very important because there's some serious lightweight individuals that are practicing some types of nutrition that's not necessarily conducive to good health for them. They are typically below 13 to 21% of their ideal body weight. That is a huge percent to be below what they're typically supposed to be at, especially for health. So when you put the flat race jockey on there with the saddle and then take out their target weight, they can be as light as about 47.7 kilograms. That's really light. If you look at jump jockeys, they're about as light as 60.4 kilograms. So these types of athletes where there's some sort of perceived biomechanical advantage are definitely fixated on body mass and body composition. Other athletes are concerned about improving performance. So if I can lose body mass, then that means that as long as I maintain my power to perform a given activity, I can actually improve the power to weight ratio. So that means I'm going to be more powerful and be able to do things with greater force per second or per minute, depending upon how you're measuring it for that given activity. There's also, of course, the concern for physical appearance. This is more applicable to sports where aesthetics seem to be more involved, such as gymnasts, ice skaters, and ballet dancers, where judges tend to favor more of the aesthetic aspect of the sport as well as the physical aspect. There are also societal trends that affect athletes, so that pursuit of leanness and being muscular. There's also of course, the money factor here, financial remuneration. What are the dangerous practices that athletes are using to lose body mass? And this is really of great concern that we need to be careful about. So the first on the list here is extreme dehydration. A lot of athletes just simply dehydrate themselves and they'll lose a certain percentage of their body mass. Really shouldn't be losing more than 2% of body mass, but of course they do lose more than that. By using a variety of methods, they'll fluid restrict. Some folks, believe it or not, will actually spit their way to some weight loss. There's even forced nosebleeds, use of sauna. This last one here, rubber or impermeable suits, has gone kind of out of favor, but I do see occasionally some individuals using this just for sheer weight loss. But again, these are all techniques that are serving to lose fluid, so you're not really losing fat mass, the kind of mass that individuals would think that they are losing. Some people do use increased exercise. Some people will fast. Some people will use diet or food restriction. Some folks end up using laxatives or even emesis or vomiting. So these are all a lot of practices that aren't necessarily conducive to good health and in some cases can hinder performance. Is there any scientific evidence to support the efficacy of these practices on performance and success? So in other words, is there something appreciable there that the athlete can wrap their minds around as far as, hey, I'm going to get an improvement in my long distance performance, or I'm going to be a wrestler that's more effective in this particular weight class? Currently, there doesn't seem to be any support for this. So it's more of an innate, inbred sort of mentality within the given sport rather than a scientific demonstration that has been shown. So this is something that we definitely want to be careful of. What are the effects of excess body mass on performance? Can you actually have a hindrance in performance because you're carrying around a couple extra pounds? Well, there's always a possibility, mechanically speaking. If you have more fat mass, then you're moving around an inert load. So there's dead weight, even though it is physiologically viable and it produces hormones. From a movement standpoint, fat mass simply doesn't aid in movement and you're just carrying around extra weight. So that could hinder performance. There are negative correlations with activities that require spatial movement, like vertical jumping and running. That could interfere with those types of activities. In swimmers, conversely here, you actually may get some more buoyancy after having a few extra pounds of fat mass hanging around. However, there hasn't been any studies that have supported this to be of any benefit in the swimmer. Metabolically speaking, what can happen? Well, there can be a decrease in the physical working capacity. So, in other words, if we have a VO2 max level that's, you measure that at 100% and now you've increased body mass, well, you're going to be working at a much higher percentage of VO2 max. So, let's say your top running speed at VO2 max was 12 miles an hour, but your typical running speed was 8 miles an hour. At that 8 miles an hour with the additional weight, you're going to be working at, instead of, let's say, 50% of VO2 max, now you're working at 60% of VO2 max. So you're working harder to carry around that extra weight. And because you're working harder, you're increasing the energy cost of movement. And some folks have measured this. TK Curitin was a big pioneer in this particular area of VO2 max and measuring the excess weight that athletes can carry around. and they found a 0.2 liter of oxygen consumed per kilogram per kilometer. So that can add up over the course of a long race. So you're working at a higher percentage, you're expending more energy because you're carrying around this added weight, which means that you're using up more fuel reserves. Research has also shown that you get a 30% reduction in running performance. So that can add up. Some other studies have looked at timing-wise as far as performance is concerned. So the addition of just 2 kilograms increased the 4,000 meter performance time by 1.5 seconds. Now that could be the difference between first and second or third place in a race. So that's pretty significant, even though it doesn't seem like much. Increased 40 kilometer trial time by 15 seconds. Again, that's huge. So that's only carrying around an additional weight of 2 kilograms of body mass. So there's definitely something here as far as the metabolic concerns. As far as the aesthetics, again, as I mentioned, the quote-unquote trained eye here of the judges may find it less appealing to see someone who's carrying around extra adipose tissue compared with someone who's not. So that might affect their artistic expression score. What determines the levels and distributions of body fat in humans? Well, of course, number one, genetics. This is going to account for about 25 to 40% of the adiposity distribution that people have. There are susceptibility genes that have been identified which do increase the risk for obesity. So the MCR4 gene mutation has been found in about 2 to 4% of the morbidly obese population, which leads to hypogonadic trophic hypogonadism. However, the important point to remember here is that the expression of the gene doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to, the fact that you have the gene isn't necessarily going to mean that you're going to express that particular gene. So that's something that we do need to be careful about, because some of these genes do tend to not express and are just quietly present in DNA. We could run the risk of, with genetics, lowering resting metabolic rate just because of the fact of DNA having a certain sequence and being programmed that way. We might end up with a high respiratory quotient, so we may end up oxidizing more carbohydrate instead of fat oxidation. So RQ, respiratory quotient, goes from 0.7 to 1.0, and if you're at a 0.7, you're utilizing more fats. If you're at a 1.0, you're utilizing carbohydrates. So a mixed diet tends to give you an RQ of about 0.83, somewhere in that ballpark. So perhaps, genetically speaking, some individuals just have a much higher RQ and are oxidizing a heck of a lot more carbohydrates than they are fats. There may be a lower rate of spontaneous physical activity, which those little bursts of activities that we do can affect, of course, the overall energy expenditure that we have. Then there's the set point theory that says that humans are programmed to weigh a certain amount of body mass, and any deviation away from that particular body mass means that the body is going to compensate. So if the person tries to lose weight, so if they're at, let's say, 200 pounds and they suddenly are down at 180, their body is going to make some changes that is going to then bring that person back up to the 100 or 200 pound mark. Conversely, if the person weighs 220 pounds because they gain 20 pounds of fat mass, let's say, then their body is going to make some changes physiologically that brings them back down to that 200 pound mark. So they are set at 200 pounds. Again, these are all theories here that I just want to also highlight that not one single of these theories is going to explain obesity as the definitive answer. It's such a complex disease that we just don't quite understand yet. So these are small pieces of the puzzle that could add up to some major significant changes as far as body fat distribution in humans. Of course, there are hormones. There are a whole slew of hormones. I've got leptin here. It's probably one of the most famous ones that has been studied in the last 20 to 30 years or so. But leptin is a hormone that's released by adipose tissue, and it's supposed to tell the hypothalamus as to the status of how much triglyceride is stored in adipocytes. In the obese, these levels are actually elevated, which indicates that perhaps the signaling pathways in the brain, the second messaging systems that are present, aren't working properly, and somehow that signal's not getting to the hypothalamus. So that is one theory. Other hormones like ghrelin you may have come across are also important as far as regulating body fat distribution. The environment that the person is in can account for as much as 70% of their body fat distribution. Of course, there's cultural transmission, which can count for 10%. So we're passing on cultural or dietary habits from generation to generation. One of my favorite quotes from Dr. Oz is something to the effect that if we all grow fatter together, then we become less attuned to being able to identify what being overweight or what obesity looks like. And I think that is a very, very real problem, and definitely speaks to the cultural or the environmental transmission of obesity. The energy intake and macronutrient distribution. Remember that energy-dense foods are all over the place, so we do want to read those food labels. Even though they're not 100% accurate, they do give us some kind of guidance. And always remember, too, that as we discussed earlier on in the course, that really the thing that's going to affect body mass the most and body composition is the fact that you have an imbalance in energy intake versus energy expenditure. As far as social and behavioral factors, we know that cafeteria or buffet-style dining is definitely associated with overeating. They're typically high-fat foods at buffets, and they're just irresistibly palatable, so we tend to embellish in that a little bit more than normal. Certainly, on occasion, going to a buffet is fine, but if we're doing that 5 to 6 days out of the week, then that can pose a problem for us. Rebellion is always an issue here. If you have an athlete that has been under a strict regimen for years, and then eating happens to be a release of pleasure for them, and they get away from that stress of being on a strict regimen, then that's a concern here, because that could then lead to overeating as well as a gain in fat mass. So there may be pressure to perform at a high level or achieve a specific body mass or body composition, so the athlete may in fact then rebel against that. In adolescence, adolescents do have tendencies towards high-fat, high-calorie foods, as well as excess alcohol consumption that we want to be aware of. These types of behaviors can also lead to what's known as disordered eating, and we're going to talk a lot more about that in Module 18, so we'll talk about that there, and I'll just briefly highlight it here. Of course, there's appetite. Appetite is important too. This is the psychological drive to eat, whereas hunger is the physiological drive to eat. Anecdotally speaking, the higher the appetite is going to be after a swim. I know that after I've spent some time in the water, I'm always a little bit hungrier. We don't know exactly why this happens, but there might be an effect of water temperature, so that's something to be aware of. In some individuals, they may actually innately increase their caloric intake to match their energy expenditure. So if you suddenly have an individual that is exercising more, they may intuitively just end up consuming more calories. We also know that high-intensity exercise, that's exercise greater than 6 metabolic equivalents or 6 METs, that does tend to stimulate appetite more so than with moderate intensity exercise. In the post-exercise, as far as appetite is concerned, that actually may change to increase carbohydrate intake and replenish glycogen stores. So there may be a more desire to snack on things that are carbohydrate rich compared with non-exercising times. As far as gender differences, there does seem to be some differences here in women. As the intensity of exercise increases, the appetite also tends to increase. And females tend to reduce their energy expenditure or increase their caloric expenditure in comparison with males in some of the literature. Training volume and status is also important as far as a consideration here. And body composition. We have athletes who will perform high intensity, long duration exercise, and they may actually have a significantly elevated post-exercise energy expenditure, or EPOC, as we saw earlier on in the course. What's kind of interesting is that EPOC doesn't seem to be a significant factor for non-athletes. So we're really talking about those individuals who are truly punishing themselves with really high intensity, long duration exercise. For the person who's just exercising regularly 2 to 3 times a week, the increase in EPOC probably isn't going to make much of a difference as far as them consuming more food to balance out the energy expenditure that they would get from their activity because of EPOC. Then we have increased aerobic capacity and fat oxidation. So the more endurance trained an individual is, the greater the capacity that person has to oxidize fat using the oxidative pathways that we talked about earlier on in the course. We know that high-intensity exercise may actually promote more fat oxidation during the recovery compared with endurance exercise. However, there's still a lot of work to be done in this area. This whole area you can look up and check out is called HIIT, or high-intensity interval training, and there seems to be something real and appreciable here with HIIT training that perhaps we could take advantage of in the athlete. Elite athletes have a significant increase in resting metabolic rate, and the main reason for that is the increase in muscle mass that they have. The more muscle mass you have, the more metabolically active you're going to be even during rest to maintain that particular tissue. So there's definitely something real and appreciable there as far as resting metabolic rate is concerned. The kind of the bad news here is that the exercise that's typically prescribed for most Americans, the AHA guidelines, American College of Sports Medicine guidelines, usually don't alter resting metabolic rate very much, simply because they're not emphasizing the increase in muscle mass. Somewhere in the literature you find, I don't remember the reference offhand, but you needed something like a 25 to 30 pound increase in muscle mass to really significantly impact resting metabolic rate over a 24-hour period. There's no significant effect on the thermic effect of food, so that still remains relatively constant. High-intensity strength training may actually promote high fat oxidation rates during the recovery period, which is kind of interesting, but we do need a little bit more research in that area. This is always kind of an interesting one to think about too. What happens during the sedentary hours when we're not exercising? And there's quite a bit of significant work in this area in probably the last 10 years or so, and discussing, well, do you offset the benefit of exercising by being sedentary the rest of the day? And it's starting to look like that there may be something there as far as health is concerned. So you can actually negate some of the benefit that you get from exercising by being more sedentary during the non-exercising hours. As far as the tapering of exercise volume for competition, you could get a loss of fat-free mass and or gain of adipose tissue, so that's also a concern as far as body composition distribution. The sport that the athlete is involved in also affects body composition distribution. Having a skill-based sport doesn't necessarily provide a lot of opportunity to improve aerobic capacity. It's there if the athlete wants it. However, most of those sports are heavily based in skill and not necessarily on the physical performance as far as fitness is concerned. The seasonal variation is also a concern. In the winter months, we do tend to have weight gain, particularly in those skill-based sports, if we're not doing anything to offset those increases in calories and therefore body mass. During November to March, this is when viruses love to multiply and make us sick. So we have increases in illness during this time, so that certainly would affect how we consume food and as well as our activity levels. What are some dietary approaches to losing fat mass? Well, there's a whole slew of these. This section certainly isn't all comprehensive, just to touch on some of the major ones that are out there. The top of the list here is the classic low-fat diet, which ad libitum of reduction in dietary fat without total energy restriction results in a reduced energy intake, and therefore you get some weight loss. So this is the classic way to approach weight loss, and it's been shown in the literature over and over again to be relatively effective in doing that. In the obese, you can actually get about a 3 to 4 kilogram loss over the course of 2 months. It doesn't sound like a lot, but every kilogram that's lost makes a huge difference as far as health is concerned. So you definitely need to get a negative caloric balance in order to get that fat loss. Otherwise, there's no reason for the body to go into fat stores and pull that fat out of stores and use it for energy. This kind of diet, a lot of people do view this as an easier way to follow in the long term, rather than some of the more restricting types of diet. But again, research needs to be done in this area. We really don't have any studies that go out 5 years, 10 years looking at these sorts of problems. These kinds of diets may not produce an energy deficit in athletes because of the high requirement for carbohydrate in order to maintain glycogen stores. So just because someone is able to reduce their fat intake by, let's say 20 grams or so, that might not necessarily result in fat mass loss, simply because they're consuming so much more carbohydrate, and they might be over-consuming that carbohydrate, which may not allow them to lose body mass. So that is kind of a little bit of a paradox with this diet in athletes. Next section is one that deals with all of the reduced carbohydrate diets. The zone diet is one of these diets that attempts to limit carbohydrate, not extremely, but to about a 30% or 40% carbohydrate level, and moderately increase protein to compensate for that. And the idea behind this diet is to reduce insulin secretion. It's all about the insulin and increasing the glucagon to insulin ratio. When you increase the glucagon to insulin ratio, you're reducing insulin, therefore the amount of glucagon that's available is going to increase. Now the benefit of that is that you are increasing lipolysis, so you're tapping into more fat stores. And then as far as health is concerned and performance as well in the athlete, that actually will, in theory, promote the regulation of eicosanoids. And the eicosanoids or a group of compounds that will release things like the series 1 prostaglandins, which by accounts of this diet are the good types of eicosanoids. They happen to be antithrombolytic, which means that they are going to reduce the platelet aggregation, reduce our risk for stroke. They have a vasodilatory action, so they tend to promote vasodilation of blood vessels, so you get increased blood flow. And the part that this particular diet targets with athletes is just this, the vasodilatory action. That is reducing the exercise-induced vasoconstriction, which then will increase blood flow and oxygen delivery to muscles and improve the substrate availability. So if I can deliver more blood flow to the working muscle, then I can give that muscle more the greater ability to basically produce ATP using oxygen, and therefore that would improve my performance. It also, under this diet, proposal here is that it reduces series 2 prostaglandins, which, according to this diet, are the bad prostaglandins, which are vasoconstrictive. So they will promote the narrowing of blood vessels and therefore lowering or impeding the blood flow to the working muscle. So this diet, as far as trying to promote the higher glucagon to insulin ratio and getting more eicosanoid production, as I mentioned, is a 40% carbohydrate diet, and you're increasing the protein a little bit more to 30% and then keeping your fat at 30%. And again, by doing this, you're increasing the availability of precursor fatty acids for good eicosanoid production, and you also get concomitant decreases in insulin concentrations and increase the glucagon amount. You'll get competitive inhibition of opposing series of pathways as well, and you get a net balance of good eicosanoids. So it's typically referred to as the 40-30-30 diet, and that's just referring back to the 40% carbohydrate, 30% protein, and 30% fat. The critique of this diet goes on quite a bit here. A lot of people have a lot of negative comments about this particular diet, and for good measure. There's some real and substantial evidence for this. Number one is that eicosanoid production is quite complex and is highly unpredictable. So just to simply manipulate the diet and then get the expected changes in the eicosanoid production, as well as the manipulation of the glucagon to insulin ratio, doesn't quite happen the way that we would expect it on this 40-30-30 diet. About a less than 25% carbohydrate intake is actually required to decrease plasma insulin levels, as the Zone diet claims. So you'd have to drop below 25% as far as your carbohydrate intake before you'd see any sort of effect in the glucagon, the insulin ratio, as well as the eicosanoid production. This diet also tends to misclassify the glycemic index of some of the foods. So remember, there's some gray area with some of those foods that they look like they might be a moderate glycemic index, but they might be placed in a high glycemic index category or a low glycemic index category. They're a little bit not what we would expect out of that particular food item. So this diet tends to misclassify some of those foods. In reality, the macronutrient distribution of 40-30-30 are actually quite difficult to get to those particular percentages. And so that is a problem. In fact, the recipes that are provided by Dr. Sears actually don't match the proposed macronutrient distribution, which really highlights the idea that the 40-30-30 diet is difficult to achieve in the diet. The athlete's eating patterns are quite different from the 40-30-30 diet. So that could pose a problem. The athlete may not want to change what they're eating, so you might get a roadblock with respect to that as well. So in reality, just like most diets that you find out there, the one common denominator really is that they're low in calories. So about 1,000 to 2,000 kilocalories per day. So they reduce the overall caloric intake, and of course that is going to promote weight loss. Now, for the athlete, this could pose a problem because if they are on this restricted caloric diet, then they might actually have fatigue and a decrease in performance because of overall calorie depletion, but as well as glycogen depletion. So currently, there's really no evidence to support that you're going to get superior performance or weight loss from this particular diet. Then we move on to the Atkins diet, which has been around for decades, and Dr. Atkins' estate has sold millions of copies of that particular book, and the diet seems to recycle every so often and come back into vogue. The most rigorous form of the diet really only allows about 30 grams of carbohydrate per day, but it doesn't limit the intake of high protein and high fat food. So you can still eat a lot of foods, it's just that you're limiting the amount of carbohydrate intake. There are a couple of really good studies that lasted for about a year looking at differences in the low-fat diet versus the higher protein diets, etc. And the interesting data that came out of it was that as far as weight loss is concerned, there was about a 4 to 6 kilogram difference as far as people losing weight on the Atkins diet compared with a traditional low carbohydrate diet that was greater at month 6 compared with the low fat diet. So there seemed to be something real and appreciable there with these individuals, that they're going to lose more fat mass at the 6-month time point on the Atkins diet versus a traditional low fat diet. However, when you go out to about a year, that difference then is reduced to 2 kilograms and becomes not statistically significant. It may still, I'd like to point out, that 2 kilograms might still be physiologically significant. So because they didn't go out past a year, we really don't know what the effects of these diets would be in the really long term. Now, some of this weight slowing as far as the weight loss was concerned in these groups was due to a regain of weight or a slowing of the weight loss. So you can look at it both ways. And health-wise, as far as cardiovascular disease risk is concerned, blood lipids were not adversely affected, as the concern was innate there with the higher protein diet and higher saturated food diet, etc. So blood lipids were not altered adversely, which is a good thing. As far as explaining why people get weight loss with the Atkins diet, well, there are a whole slew of reasons why. Number one here is satiety. We know that higher protein foods, as well as high fat foods, have this ability to satiate us. So they satisfy the psychological drive to eat, which is a good thing, which means if I'm satisfied, I'm more apt to eat less. Thermogenesis, perhaps there's an alteration in thermogenesis where we're increasing the energy that's expended just to maintain body temperature somehow. Perhaps there's an increase in energy expenditure. Perhaps it's the simplicity or monotony of the diet, always eating those higher protein diet foods. Perhaps it's a reduced glycemic load or better control of insulin levels. We don't know for sure. One of the things that was made clear was that it wasn't related to the amount of ketosis. So ketosis is not something that is going to promote fat loss. As far as the concerns for the diets are for the athletes on this diet, there's no study that's really evaluated the effect of this diet on athletes. So there's really no way to say either way. The only thing that we should do and keep in mind is if the athlete wants to try this particular diet, is that we should monitor them very, very closely for various health parameters to make sure that their health isn't being adversely affected. We do know that the diet is a little too low in carbohydrate, and that may reduce performance. So we do want to be careful of that as well. We know that the diet can cause nausea and headaches and fatigue, which of course would then mean that the athlete's not going to work out as hard and their performance can suffer. Again, I want to stress that the long-term safety beyond a year has not been evaluated, so we just don't know. I mean, this goes the same for the low-fat diet. We just don't know what the long-term, long-range effects of these diets are going to be. As far as the ketotic effects here, we know that that can promote hyperlipidemia, so you can get your blood lipids out of whack, and they can increase your cardiovascular disease risk profile. You can impair the neutrophil function, so your immune function is going to be dampened a little bit. Optic neuropathy, so the optic nerve might actually get some damage. Osteoporosis is a possibility, so the weakening of bone through a lowering of bone mineral density, and there's always a possibility of also altering cognitive function. So these are all concerns that we have because of ketosis. So the diet is going to be below the DRI for many of the nutrients, which also is a concern, because if the athlete is expending all of these calories and they need these nutrients, they need to replace the nutrients, they may not be getting a variety enough of foods to compensate for all of the nutrient loss. Then we have the utilization of the glycemic index. This is another way of manipulating calories here, and lower GI foods may actually help facilitate weight loss, and they do so by enhancing satiety. So they are much higher in fiber, at least they tend to be, so that does satiate us as well, just like fat and protein did. They minimize the postprandial insulin secretion, which is good, so you get better glucose control. You maintain insulin sensitivity as well, which is important. So there is some evidence that suggests that weight loss might be greater with a lower glycemic index food compared with a diet that's high in glycemic index. We also may get a benefit from athletes because it does not limit carbohydrate intake. That's the beauty of the glycemic index, really, is that you're still consuming carbohydrates, still the athlete is getting what they need, but they're not necessarily eating the types of foods that are going to give you those spikes, huge spikes in glucose. It's also not associated with an increased risk for diet-related diseases. So those are all pluses for the glycemic index. And as we discussed earlier, however, the problem is that it's not necessarily the easiest system to use because of how complicated it can be when we're eating mixed meals. So there is some scientific evidence out there for the glycemic index, and certainly a very interesting and promising area of research, but we definitely need more research in this area before we make these mass sweeping general recommendations. Then we have good old manipulating of energy density. So just by manipulating how concentrated the energy is in the diet, can we change the fat mass distribution and use that to our advantage to lose fat mass. And the principle here is that most people are tending to eat a similar weight of food irrespective of the macronutrient distribution. So it seems that the overall weight might have an effect as far as us getting sufficient amount of perceived need by the human body as far as calories are concerned. And that's irrespective of macronutrient distribution. So perhaps the fat content and the carbohydrate content and the protein content, those percentages as far as overall contribution to the caloric intake may not necessarily be as important as the overall weight, at least according to some of this work that's out there. So since fat is going to have a much higher density, energy density, than if you're consuming a higher fat diet, then you may actually end up with a higher amount of fat mass. So conversely, if we have a lower fat diet, then we have less energy density in the diet, despite still eating about the same amount of weight in food. So having that higher fat diet may actually promote the passive overconsumption or hyperphagia of food. Then there's the idea of consuming calcium and dairy products for weight loss. And this is all based on some work that was done that found an inverse relationship between dietary calcium or dairy intake and body mass index and body fat and incidence of obesity. So in other words, the higher my calcium intake is, whether that be through the diet or from taking a supplement or from dairy-rich foods, then the lower my body mass index and body fat and incidence of obesity was going to be. There was also a negative association between dairy intake and insulin resistance, so it doesn't seem to promote insulin resistance. So going from a suboptimal to an optimal level of calcium is the key here, because that's where we saw individuals really get a lot of benefit from this. So you had to be consuming less than optimal levels of calcium in order to get this effect of fat loss. So if you're already consuming sufficient amounts of calcium, then at least through some of this literature, it doesn't seem like it has any effect. And it tends to work better with dairy foods compared with getting your calcium supplements. As far as the mechanisms of this, well, we do know that intracellular calcium plays a role in the regulation of adipocyte metabolism and as well as triglyceride storage. So it is controlling that because calcium is regulated by the parathyroid hormone as well as a very, very important vitamin, 1,25-dihydroxy vitamin D3, which is acting as a hormone. So there seems to be a link there with calcium as well as vitamin D. In fact, vitamin D is probably one of those really hot vitamins right now that are being studied very, very heavily from just about anything you can think of under the sun here, from disease to athletic performance. So it's a really exciting time in the vitamin D world, and we'll probably see some changes down the road here as far as our intake of vitamin D is concerned. Dairy products are also a very good source of branched-chain amino acids, as well as angiotensin converting enzyme, or ACE, which will help with lowering of blood pressure. So this actually may help with obesity and lowering the risk for obesity. However, again, more research is needed in this area to tease out these mechanisms. Then we have the very low energy diets, or VLEDs. These are getting the athlete only about 400 to 600 kilocalories. That's less than 100 grams of carbohydrate per day. So it's pretty low. Even the caloric intake here is just unusually low for an athlete. That's typically given as a liquid meal, and then you add some micronutrients to make sure that that person's getting everything that they need. And you'll get about a 1.5 to 2 kilogram loss in body mass per week. And the loss is not often sustained, so then you have to make a readjustment to the caloric intake. And this is something that an athlete may catch wind of, being on one of these very low energy diets, but it's really not a diet recommended for most people. In fact, it's reserved really for the very obese, as opposed to the athlete looking to shed 5 pounds of fat mass here. The other issue here is that most of the time when these diets are being prescribed, the person is under the careful watch of a healthcare team. So that's an important distinction to make as well, because of the low calorie intake, the micronutrient intake is a huge concern, which is why it needs to be added to these liquid meals. As far as side effects from this, well, huge list here, and this is a short list. There are definitely others that could possibly pop up, but we've got nausea that can happen, halitosis, so some bad breath. We got hunger, which could decrease after the onset of ketosis, headaches, hypotension, lightheadedness, precipitation of gout, which is a form of arthritis. We've got glycogen depletion, a loss of lean body mass, dehydration, electrolyte imbalances, and hypotension, which I apologize, that's on the list twice, so it must be twice as important as all the others, right? Then we have Weight Watchers as a weight loss program. This is actually a sound program that was designed by a medical doctor as well as a registered dietitian. And the whole idea behind this program is really just to help the person regulate caloric intake. That's why people lose weight on this. So it's teaching people portion control more than anything else, more than looking at macronutrient distribution. It's more about just regulating portions. There are some works out there, as far as the literature are concerned, that try to score each of the diets as far as their nutritional adequacy goes and physical activity. and supplement recommendations are concerned. And so the high score is, or perfect score is 100 points. So you've got the volumetrics weight controlled plan that scored a 97% here, and then it just goes down from there. So there have been some attempts at trying to quantify, well, is there any merit to a particular diet? And in most of these diets, again, the common denominator here is that they're controlling calories, and if you follow the diets to a T, then the person is going to lose weight simply because the caloric intake is less. What are some of the recommendations regarding exercise for fat loss in the athlete? Well, we have the idea of high versus low intensity exercise. There's a lower proportion of fats that are going to be oxidized with high intensity. However, the energy deficit may be greater with high intensity exercise. So that's something to consider here. A lot of times for fat loss, people recommend that we do longer duration, lower intensity, or moderate intensity exercise for fat loss. And it's true that fat oxidation would be optimized there or maximized, but really what we're trying to do is create an energy deficit, and there's no better way to do that than high intensity exercise. So there is, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of work going into the high intensity interval training as a way of getting fat loss in a much shorter period of time compared with doing endurance type of exercise. So this could be an attractive technique for athletes who have lots of time constraints. However, the one area of concern here is the fact that you may increase the risk for musculoskeletal injury. So that's always a concern. We want to use it very, very carefully, and of course not overdoing it with the high intensity work. As far as a modality is concerned, a weight-bearing type of exercise is always going to be preferred simply because you're going to burn more calories with those types of activities. So any kind of activity where you have to move your entire body weight, that's what's considered a weight-bearing activity. So running would be an excellent example of this. And it seems that running in the literature happens to be, and this is probably not something that those individuals who don't like running like to hear, but it actually has some superior weight control benefit compared with other modalities. And we're not quite sure exactly what that component is. They're still trying to work on that and tease that out. However, of course, your modality choice could increase your risk for musculoskeletal injuries. If you're working with non-athletes, then the recommendations are to follow an organization's guidelines. So you could follow the American College of Sports Medicine guidelines. They're certainly out there and a nice guideline to follow. You could also use the model of 50% VO2 max and try and get the maximal fat oxidation. But again, what we're trying to do is create a caloric deficit, and there's no better way to do that than to exercise at higher intensities. But in a non-athlete, we do want to be careful because of the risk for musculoskeletal injuries. Are there any negative effects of weight control in athletes? Well, performance-wise, creating that energy restriction could be detrimental to performance rather than carrying around the extra body fat. So is there a benefit-risk ratio here? Absolutely. You may actually get more benefit out of just carrying around those extra few pounds of body fat rather than taking the risk of trying to reduce body fat and reduce performance more so than having the extra body fat. So that's something you definitely want to look at on a case-by-case basis, on an individual basis. We know that a 5% reduction in body mass can reduce performance quite significantly, especially in groups of individuals like high-intensity sprinters. So a 5% loss in body mass usually results in about a 54% loss in muscle glycogen. That could be significant. We know that dehydration is a concern, so depending upon how the athlete approaches the weight loss, dehydration can reduce that plasma volume. A mere 5% loss in body mass is going to result in about a 12.5% loss of plasma volume, that fluid portion of blood that's necessary to transport everything. So that could present problems. This increases the susceptibility to heat-related illnesses and even increases the risk for death. There are menstrual and endocrine disturbances. We're going to talk a lot more about the female athlete triad in Module 19. It's a very, very important issue that comes up in dealing with female athletes. In males, there can be reduced testosterone, and in women, we can also have reduction in prolactin levels. This may return to normal once body mass loss is terminated. So once the athlete stops trying to lose body mass, then these levels tend to come back to normal. Reductions in fat-free mass and resting metabolic rate are always a concern. This is going to happen even if the athlete is weight training during their dieting. So if you look at a group of bodybuilders, they're always going to lose a little bit of fat-free mass, as well as their RMR is going to drop. And in an athlete that's using their body to move physically, that could be significant for them. It's usually reversible once the dieting does stop. In children, however, we're not quite sure if there's any stunting of growth in children if this sort of regimen is going on. So what's the potential for long-term growth here, and is it going to be affected by that? Bone density, bone mineral density. There's always the increase for risk for osteopenia, depending upon if the diet is rich in the micronutrients necessary. These results actually may not be reversible, as we'll talk about with the female athlete triad. So that's a concern, big concern. There may be a depressed immune system because of the lack of carbohydrate intake and how fats are involved in the immune system. We also may upset the antioxidant balance versus the oxidation that's going on. So there may actually be a lower amount of antioxidants to protect the athlete. There may be psychological effects, maybe decreased cognition. There may be some mood disturbances, or even a risk for disordered eating, as we'll talk about a little bit later in the course. Their nutrient status may be affected. In the short term, probably not, because we do store a lot of nutrients, so in like a week or so, that's not a big deal. But in the long term, you spread that out, that diet out over weeks, then that can pose some significant problems for the athlete. So finally, we come to practical application of this material. Number one, if you're dealing with athletes who are competing in some sort of weight class, you need to make sure you understand those weight class rules and the ins and outs of why athletes feel that, wrestling, for example, at a lower weight class is going to give them some sort of benefit. We also want to assess the athlete's needs and goals for fat loss. And segueing into this is the fact that we want to measure body composition and make sure that the athlete, in fact, needs to lose that fat loss, and that there would be some sort of real and appreciable increase in performance as a result of losing that body fat. We, of course, want to obtain a medical history and make sure that anything that we're doing with the athlete isn't going to increase a risk for some sort of illness. Diet analysis is always recommended. It's nice to measure RMR when you can, so that you can see any changes in resting metabolic rate and how that's affected. We also want to assess the current energy expenditure so that we're regulating the amount of energy intake very, very carefully, so we're not promoting too much of a deficit there. Usually it's better to start with a lower fat diet, so just lowering the amount of fat. This way we're not removing anything from the diet, and moderation as far as energy restriction is concerned is always the safest and best practice to start off with. We want to make sure that we're not missing out on any nutrients, so protein, fiber, using low glycemic index carbohydrates with each meal. These are all great tactics to use to ensure that there's macronutrient adequacy. So nutrient density is absolutely critical. We don't want to lose out on anything like iron or calcium, etc., and affect the athlete's long-term health. So we want to make sure that carbohydrate is adequate, and of course we have guidelines for that outside of the 60 to 70% of total kcals that are recommended here. As far as protein, at least 1.2 grams per kilogram of body mass, and ensure adequate levels of micronutrients like calcium from dairy foods. As far as exercise is concerned, you can use a variety of modalities and a variety of intensities. So you could do low to moderate intensity exercise, so that's about 1 to 3 METs of activity at 50 to 60% of VO2 max for about 60 minutes. If you move up to moderate intensity, which is 3 to 6 METs, and that's 65 to 70% of VO2 max for about 30 to 60 minutes. And of course, we can move on to high intensity exercise, which is greater than 6 METs, and use that again judiciously so that we're not running the risk of a musculoskeletal injury. And we do want to use resistance training so that we can increase lean body mass and possibly affect resting metabolic rate so that we create a higher need for energy expenditure. Of course, there are behavioral modifications that we might want to consider. We also want to save any of this fat loss for the off season. This is not something that we want to try with the athlete during the competitive season for obvious reasons of performance decrements. So use a 12-month plan when it comes to the training season, the off season, etc., to help the athlete achieve their goals. As far as their body mass losses, you shouldn't get more than about a half a kilogram of fat loss per week. That's it. I know that doesn't sound like much, but that is moderate fat loss, and that's a healthy way to reduce body fat. So if you're measuring skin folds, you shouldn't get more than a 5 millimeter difference when you use the 7 or 8 site equations for measuring body fat. There shouldn't be much of a difference there. And last on the list here, of course, traveling considerations. Those are always important to think about when you're planning these kinds of regimens for the athlete that you're working with.